Hi folks, Wayne Golding here from Access Direct in New Zealand. Today I'm going to show you how I build a dashboard web page in Xojo. Dashboard pages are somewhat special in that they present the same dynamic information to multiple users. I'm going to use a couple of design patterns. The first will be the singleton design pattern to create a single instance of the class that collects the information, and the observer pattern to push the updates out to registered controls. I'll be presenting this process in an evolutionary style, starting simple and adding complexity until I reach my goal. But first, let's have a look at the finished article. There we go. Okay, so we can see that we have three components on this, or three controls on this web page. We have the queue length on the top left corner, which we can see is red at the moment. It goes, the colors change depending on how many messages are in the queue. Next to that we have the data that's happened so far today, and we can see how many chunks from how many messages. Under that we have the chart, which shows the last 28 days, with today being the rightmost column. Okay, so let's get into coding this thing. Okay, first of all, I've created a web project here. It has an extension method already in it, this one here, which simply returns a date at 12 AM on the day that's passed. This is very useful for using in SQL select statements when you want to get a date range. Nice and simple to keep it there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a dashboard class, data class. So I'm going to take one that I have pre-baked, and we'll go through it. Okay, here's our new dashboard data class. It's just a standard class. It has no super. I have some properties down here. Just move that over a little bit. Okay, so we've got some properties here. We've got chart labels and values for the chart. I've got chunks and messages for what has been sent today, and I have queue length, which just tells us how many messages are in the queue. Those are all private properties, private member properties. I've got public getter methods, which simply return the values of those properties. And the point of that is that the properties are read-only outside of the class. Okay, I also have a database property here, keep a connection to our database, and we've got this constructor method here. So let's just work our way through the constructor method. First of all, I create a new SQLite database object. I pass the folder item to it, the database file. In here, we try to connect to the database, and if we get an error, I'm just at the moment breaking because I don't want to, I want to be able to debug. Normally, you would put in some error handling, right to the event log and then close the application. Next, I have the history data. So what I'm doing is I am getting 28 days worth of data from the statistics table, which simply holds a chunk count for the day. Okay, so we're adding to our chart labels property list the date converted to a string and the number of chunks that we sent that day. And then I'm adding a label to the end, which is today, because our chart is going to represent today as well. Now, next we've got our dynamic data. So the first thing we do here is we get a count of the messages that we've sent today and a sum of the chunks that we have sent. And of course we store those in our messages and chunks. And we also add a column or a value for the right-hand column in the history chart. And lastly, we get a count of the messages to be sent that are in the queue, and we put that into the queue length column. Okay, so we've got that. I can now go into my app, and if I add an opening event handler, I can create an instance of the dashboard data, and we'll break, and we'll just make sure that it actually works. I'll save project at this point, and we'll run it and see how it looks. So if we have a look in here, okay, we can leave that. We have 28 dates. We have 28 values, and we have the number of chunks we've sent today, the messages we've sent today, and at the moment, as at running, we have 466 messages in the queue. So I'll just comment that out for the moment. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to make this class dynamic. And we're going to do that by changing its super to a timer. Just a standard timer, not a web timer. It doesn't know about sessions. And we are going to make some adjustments to our constructor method. So we want to take our dynamic data part here, and we want to convert that to a method. Okay, so that's going to be dynamic. Right, so first of all, we need to specify rows again. Okay, and we need to look at this part here. We can't keep on adding every X seconds another column onto our history chart. So we need to adjust this, and we will do that by changing this to so we're just going to simply replace that last value now, and we can get rid of that. Okay, so now every time we're just going to replace the last value in our chart, which means that we need to have a last value. So we'll add something in here just to fill in the space. Okay, so now we'll construct it, we'll call dynamic data, which will replace this 0 with the actual figure. Now we need to use that and make that happen, so we want to add an event handler, the action event for the timer, and we want to run dynamic data to update the methods. Okay, and that means, of course, that we need to actually get the timer to run. So we're going to run it every 15 seconds, and the run mode will be multiple. So every 15 seconds, it'll fire and re-update the data. Okay, now I'm going to make this class a singleton class. Okay, and we can do that very simply by making the constructor private, so it can't be run from outside. And we're going to add a shared property, which we'll call minstance, and it will be a dashboard data class, or dashboard data object once it's instantiated. And we'll add a shared method, which we'll call getInstance, which will return a dashboard data, and it will be public. Okay, and in this method, if the instance is null, we create a new dashboard data object and we save it into instance, and then we return instance. So if the instance already exists, it will simply return a reference to the existing instance. So there can only be one of this dashboard data object ever in this application based on this. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is make this class the subject of the observer pattern. Now, because there's only ever going to be one of these, I'm not going to have any other subjects for those observers. I don't need to use a class interface. So what I will do is I will create a property, and we'll save those. Okay, so our observers, which is an array of observers, is a data notification receiver. And a data notification receiver is a built-in class interface. So any controls on the web page that implement that interface can be referenced from this object. Now I'm going to add a couple of methods, public methods. So we've got add data notification receiver, and that simply saves the receiver into the list of observers. And then we're going to add a remove event as well. So the remove loops through the observers, and if it finds the observer, it removes it, and then we return, so we don't continue to process the loop. So basically now any class that implements the receiver, or the data notification receiver interface, can now get data from, or can now be stored and register themselves as objects, observer objects. Okay, now to use those, or to update the observers, we need to loop through them and update them. So and you can see that there is only one method that we can call on the observer, and that is the one that is specified in the data notification receiver interface. Okay, now we can start adding our observers. I'll just clear up that a bit, make it a bit easier to see. So we have 3 controls on the web page that need to be made into observers. So this is the queue length button observer. So we have 2 properties in here, 2 private properties. We've got session as web session, and we have subject as dashboard data. In our event handlers, in our shown event, we save the session, current session. We get a reference to the dashboard data, and we register this object as an observer. In our closed event, we do the opposite. We remove this object and we null the subject. Now, because this class implements the data notification receiver interface, we have a method in here, data changed, which is specified by that interface. And this is where we actually update the value of the control. First of all, we create a context, a web session context, and we use that session variable that we saved. The reason for that is that this method is going to be called from the dashboard data class, and the dashboard data class does not know which session this control belongs to. By doing this, we tell the framework which session this control belongs to, and so we can actually use it. Next, we update the caption to show the number of messages that are in the queue, In this section here, we change the indicator depending on how many messages are in the queue. And finally, we update the browser. Now, the Today button does essentially the same thing. The only thing that changes is what we put onto the caption. So everything else is the same. So as far as the dashboard data class is concerned, the Today button and the queue length button are both simply data notification receivers. And that's even more obvious when we add in the history chart custom control. Again, as far as the dashboard is concerned, dashboard data class is concerned, this is just another data receiver. If we have a look in here, though, things change slightly. We now have a data set, which we're storing. In our event handlers and shown, we are now adding our labels and the initial values from and we're creating our data set with the initial values that are in the dashboard data class. And finally, we're adding it to the chart. In our data changed event, a little bit more complex. Again, we're creating our web session context, which we've seen before. First of all, we are removing the data set at 0. Then we're getting the chart values. We're storing those separately because we need to be able to reference a particular point. We're taking the last one. I could use last index, but we know that there are only 28 days of data on that chart, so 27 is 27. Okay, so we're replacing the value at 27 in the data set, and then we're re-adding it, and then we update the browser. So let's use those controls now. So I'm going to just clean up this again. Right, so we've got, first of all, our queue length button, which we want to put at the top left corner of the page. And I'm going to make that 300 wide. And we need the Today button, which I'm going to put in here, make that 400 wide. And I'm going to set the indicator to success, so it's nice and green. And I'm going to drag the history chart on, put it here, and I'm going to make it as wide as the thing, and I'm going to turn on has legend so that we can see the names or name of the graph. So let's have a look-see. Okay, so we can see that our chart looks nice. I'm not too sure about those buttons, but let's see what happens when the timer triggers. And there we go. So every 15 seconds, those numbers should update. You will have noticed in the demo that it was a lot quicker, but I specifically slowed this down so that we can see that result. Okay, so we want those buttons to update immediately. So the obvious thing to do here is in the Add Data Notification Receiver, we can go call Receiver Data Changed. This won't work. I'll show you what happens. Okay, we get an unsupported operation exception. And the reason for that is that because the Add Data Notification Receiver method in the dashboard data class is being invoked from the shown event, the context is known, and this breaks it. It is, however, very simple to fix that. and that is to use a timer. Zero milliseconds, address of. So what this does is actually push the data changed event into the next event loop, 0 milliseconds. And that means that we no longer know the web session context. So let's try that again. And we can see that it's near instantaneous that those two buttons are updated. All right, now this will work, but it is relying on there being no browsers showing the web page at midnight. So therefore, we're relying on basically a new instance being created shortly after midnight, and that won't happen if a browser is left open. So what we're going to end up with is we're not going to end up updating the history data correctly. So again, I'm going to move this chunk of code and convert it to a method. That we can call elsewhere as well. We need to make some slight adjustments to that method now. So let's go into history data, and what we need to do basically is clear out anything that's already there by emptying the two tables or arrays. Okay, so now we need to trigger this in the action event, but we only want to trigger it if the date has changed. So I'm going to add a property, which of course is private. And in history data, we're going to say save the date part as at that point. Now in our action, before dynamic data, we can update our history data. Okay, so now when the timer ticks over to midnight, the date will change and the history data will get recreated, and everything else continues as you would expect. Okay, almost there, folks. Now that we've got it all working, the next thing we want to do is optimize it. And we're going to optimize it by only actually telling the browser to update if the data has changed. So for that, we need to add a property. Okay, so now in our action event, the first thing we're going to do is set that to false. If our history data has changed, then we want to change it to true. And in our dynamic data, we now need to run some tests. So what we want to do is we want to wrap some code in if statements. Okay, not particularly granular, but basically what it says is if the message count has changed, then all of these items will have changed. Set the data change to true. Likewise here. So now we can come up into here and we can wrap this. And only update the observers if the data has changed. And that is how I build a dashboard page using a Xojo Web. Okay.